Welcome to BC the Beatles, the podcast about the Beatles, everything about the Beatles, 24/8. I'm Erica.
And I'm Allison. And before we start, please be sure to follow us on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts, or stream us on Spotify. If you're enjoying Because the Beatles, please feel free to leave us a preferably 5-star review so other Beatle maniacs can find us.
Also, don't forget to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. We'll be posting videos, photos, and more from this episode and beyond. You can also email us at bcthebeatles@gmail.com.
Well, hello again.
Hello again. We got back. We said we're going to get back, and we got back.
Yes, we kept our word. We did indeed get back in true Paul got back fashion.
As always, he continues to inspire.
He is truly our beacon. He's like our St. Paul of lost episodes where he tells us what to do and we do it. It's perfect.
There we go.
Exactly. Well, I did something very non-Paul. Like I talked last episode about seeing Paul, and Paul's been very looming large in my life at the moment. But I don't know. I got this wild hair, and I saw that Nowhere Boy is streaming on this app called Canopy. Have we talked about Canopy?
I don't think so.
No, I was talking something about Canopy, but it's so if you guys have library cards or library access, you can get access to this like amazing streaming service called Canopy, and it's got movies, documentaries, TV shows, but it's all through your library, so it's all basically free.
Wow.
Yeah, and right now, or at least it was a couple weeks ago when I watched it, Nowhere Boy was streaming, and I remember seeing it when it came out, and I didn't love it. Did you see it when it came out?
Yeah, and I felt kind of the same way. I didn't love it.
The way it sort of portrays Julia Lennon as being so friggin' creepy, where she's like this MILF that's like hot to trot with all of John's friends. Mm-hmm. And there's like a slight like incestuous like vein. Yeah, I didn't love it. I rewatched it and I don't know, I think in a lot of ways it's more even-handed than a lot of biopics of John that sort of like deify him. Obviously, like everything made about John ever pretty much deifies him in some way. Or if they go to the other spectrum and he's a monster. I think Nowhere Boy is pretty even-handed. I like that it has a lot of ancillary characters like his cousins and his aunts and like what his life is probably like in Liverpool. But yeah, Julia, the fucking character is just so off the walls. Like she's so hypersexualized for his mom, which I don't know. I have a hard time believing that was who she really was.
Yeah, there's a fine line between free spirit and unconventional and potentially wants to have sex with your son. Like there's a line there.
There's a slight difference there, just a tiny little bit. Yeah, and I think also the character of Mimi is, I think that's actually a better Mimi that's in Nowhere Boy. And I think the relationship between Mimi and John is better in Nowhere Boy than in a lot of shows. Because, usually it's like, oh, Mimi, she's a wet blanket. She's like trying to get harsh my mellow and she doesn't want me to play guitar. She says I'll never make a living or whatever. But this Mimi is a lot more, she gets a lot of wiggle room in that aspect where you see her like buying John a guitar and, actually supporting him a little bit and going to his performances and supporting him as he grows up. And you see her probably more as she was, which was a mother to him.
Yeah.
And then Julie is just like this like fuck up little rogue over here who's like, slutting around with 15-year-olds. So yeah, my opinion about Nowhere Boy has really not changed. That's okay. But something that has come to light this week, I don't know if it's new or whatever, but shout out to my friend Jen who turned me onto it. So there's a tool online you can kind of use to figure out your favorite Beatles song. And you do this via Song Battles. So it presents you with two song options, and you can choose one or the other. You can pick tie. I think you can skip it. You can choose which albums you want to pull the songs from, like when you click onto the website. And we will drop the website address in our show description, so you can do it for yourself. But you can remove the George Martin film score to Yellow Submarine. You can remove like cover songs, anthology demos, and you can pick which Beatles albums you want to choose your song battles from. So it's a really intensive process. I'm 358 battles in. I'm 35% through. And I've learned a lot, I must say, about my Beatle preferences. I mean, I always knew I skewed earlier, but I never realized until my hand was held to the fire, how many songs I would pick over I Am the Walrus.
Yeah.
I never knew. I was like, oh, okay. So I like that one more than I Am the Walrus. Interesting.
This is an interesting thing. I'm looking at it right now, and it's hard. It's hard to decide sometimes, even between two.
It's hard, not just with songs you like, but songs you hate. It's like, okay, which one of these fucking songs do I hate the least? If you present me with Don't Pass Me By and Octopus's Garden, I don't know. It's like, let me just randomly pick one of these.
That's a tough thing. And there is no button here that says exclude the Ringo song. So unfortunately, you have to go through it.
Yeah, that would be a good one. I mean, I would, yeah. Remove song duplicates. There's a button here for that. I don't know. I've getting a lot of duplicates, but I think that's probably the algorithm trying to figure out exactly like your ranking of these songs. I'm not sure what the end result is. So I don't know if you get presented with your top 10 or whatever, or it's just like your one shining, gleaming favorite Beatles song. But I'm interested to see if it matches up with like what I feel is my favorite Beatles song, which is And Your Bird Can Sing. So we'll see.
Oh my God, that's the one that's on my screen right now. I have to choose between And Your Bird Can Sing and Wait.
I mean, I know what I pick, but that's a hard one because Wait's a great song too.
I find this one very hard. Like, I'm just not choosing right now. I'm only 1% done. So I have a long time to go.
I got presented one time with Bad Boy versus Matchbox, and I was like, oh, fuck. The devil himself served me this because I love both of those tracks so much from Past Masters Volume 1.
Which way did you end up going?
I went Bad Boy. It's just a little bit more than Matchbox. And yes, Matchbox is a Ringo song, and I fucking love it. I love the original. I love the Carl Perkins original. I love all of it.
We've got revelations here today for you. We are serving them up hot.
Hot takes. But yeah, so check out this tool and let us know what you get, how you like it, because it's really hard.
I'm very curious. Does your favorite song, according to this tool, actually match up to what you think it's going to be, or even close?
Yeah, 100%. We'll post our results too when we finally complete this. I'm 362 battles now because I've done a couple as we've been talking. It's 36%. So that's got to mean there's like almost 1,000 battles, right?
Yeah.
Got to be over 1,000.
I guess it's good that we excluded duplicates or whatever. It's probably puts at it so much more.
Well, you were saying that you would probably exclude covers.
I probably would. I just know that in the quest to find favorite songs or top songs, it's not going to be, Please Mr. Postman. It's just not going to be anywhere near there. So maybe we can just like toss those now.
But like, what about definitive covers? Like a lot of people would say like Twist and Shout is like the definitive cover of the Beatles. And I don't know, Twist and Shout might end up in like my top 25 or something.
Okay. That's an argument definitely to not exclude those. Know yourself.
Know yourself and your Beatles tastes. That's the moral of the story here.
Yes. Just side note, in case you hear it, my dog is having a dream and she's barking in her dream.
Oh, there she is, Rosie.
Yeah.
Aww.
I knew she'd make an appearance in some way.
I'm so glad. My cat, Epi, he was here and then he left. I think he just got annoyed because he probably wants to sleep in silence. I thought maybe he'd do some purring into the mic. He might come back. We'll see.
The episode is young.
It is.
And speaking of young, Paul's tour is actually still quite young.
Love that segue for us.
I know, it's perfect.
That was great. That was good. Loved it.
And while we went over some of Allison's initial experiences in the first week or so of Paul's tour, he's still got to visit the East Coast, and we're going to see a little more. So we were trying to decide where to go and when to do it. Where should we go?
Yeah, I'm really considering flying out to some of the East Coast shows, and you're kind of considering a few different ones. So you've got your eye sort of on Syracuse, right?
I'm interested in the Syracuse show because it really is out of the way compared to some of these major hotspots he's hitting. And I'm wondering if it's maybe quite a bit smaller, more intimate.
I can't remember if I mentioned in our Got Back episode, but the LA show at SoFi was, I think, 70 to 100,000 cap. Whereas I saw him in Oakland Arena, which is 19,000. And honestly, that makes all the difference for sure. So I would say if you could see Paul on the tour, smaller the better, especially where arenas are concerned. We saw him in Nassau, right? And that didn't feel terribly big to me.
No, that was pretty small. That was nice and intimate. I saw him once in State College, where Penn State is, at the Penn State basketball arena. So it was like a college basketball arena. So it was small. It was cool.
That is really small. I can't believe you played that. That's so cool.
It was great.
So yeah, as we're considering it, let us know if you guys are going to shows on the East Coast. What looks good to you? We're definitely looking at all the ticket sites. We'll see what we come up with. I'm excited to begin the adventure anew for more Paul shows.
It's never been just going online, buying tickets, and being sad. It's always been a thing. Part of the fun.
Well, guys, since we're talking about Paul live, as we mentioned in our last episode, we are talking about some of like Paul's and the Beatles' very significant moments in their live careers. And one thing that we both thought of right away was when Paul played in Moscow and St. Petersburg in 2003 and 2004. And if you guys have seen the documentary, there's a David Frost film that came out about it. I believe it's just called Paul in Red Square. You can find it on YouTube. We'll drop a link in our show notes. And we just decided to look back on it.
Yeah, considering some of the horrible stuff that's going on right now with Russia and the Ukraine and Vladimir Putin, it's a very interesting look back.
Yeah, Putin, this whole thing has really inspired some very complicated Putin thoughts, because obviously now we know he's a monster. Back then, not so much. It was pretty wild to see Putin in this Paul documentary after so many years since having seen it for the first time, and everything that's happened since then, obviously.
Yeah, not just Putin, but, Putin and Heather.
Oh, yeah. I posted on my Instagram story when I started to watch the documentary, and they show, like, right at the top of the show, there's a shot of Paul walking between Putin and Heather, which I'm going to guess is going to be what we're going to post on our socials when we post this episode. So you've probably seen it already. It's like, Paul, you are, I don't even know what to say to you. You are in the middle of something that you cannot handle right now. I don't know what's worse for you.
Like, I don't know what's going on with Paul and like the aughts, because in our last season, we did a recap of the 9/11 video or film that he did, the documentary about the concert for New York City. And I thought that was the worst Paul moment, when he was having a jovial conversation with Bill Clinton about how awesome Harvey Weinstein is. Like, to me, in the pantheon of things that don't age well, that was pretty rough. I think that Paul having a friendly walk with Putin and Heather Mills might be one tick above that one.
Yes, I have so many thoughts. I've been thinking all week as we've been working on this episode about just how fucking chaotic the aughts were for Paul McCartney. I think he hit it on the head when he named his 2005 album Chaos and Creation, because it was a fucking mess up until then. Pretty much. I think things sort of started to smooth out towards the end of the aughts, but wow.
Yeah, I would consider that entire decade, at least until like Memory Almost Full came out, as the Linda grieving years, and a lot of fucked up stuff happened.
Yeah, that was definitely his like sort of like hot girl summer, gonna just go crazy. Like, I don't know what I'm doing anymore. Well, before we get too deep into Putin gate, as we'll call it, let's talk a little bit about Russia and communism and the backstory about leading up to Paul going to Moscow in 2003. So you guys probably have heard a lot about the Iron Curtain in the Soviet Union and the bloc, and how you could not really access rock and roll music in Russia until really the early 90s. And that's because, around the time of the Cold War, the Communist Soviet Union, which is the USSR in song by Paul McCartney, that's when they were becoming really wary of these Western influences in pop culture, anything that might encourage free thinking in its citizens, which is the enemy of communism. So not only was it really hard to get rock and roll records, it was super duper expensive. One LP of any kind on the black market could cost a half a month's wages, which back then, I mean, if you're living in communist society too, those are precious, precious money.
You're already waiting on the bread line.
Yeah, exactly. That makes it virtually non-existent for you to have music. But one thing I loved in researching this that I didn't know about, I never heard about, were things called bone records. So people would smuggle records in, and usually it was actors or politicians even, people that work for different party lines, or just people traveling. They would sneak in records from England or wherever they were traveling from. And so they'd be distributed on the black market, sold very expensively, but then people would get a hold of them and make copies. And what they used to make copies were old vinyl x-rays. And I never thought about this, but those x-rays, they took them and they used just a disc cutter to make copies of these records. And of course, they were like flimsier. They weren't like 180 gram, 140 gram vinyl, which we're used to today. But, you know, if you consider in the 60s, fucking records came on the back of a cereal box. Like, I've got a Dave Clark 5 record that was in a cereal box in the 60s. It's like, you could really kind of make a record out of anything.
That's crazy.
Yeah. And so they called them bone records, not only because they were made from x-rays, but you could actually like see broken bones on the records. Like you could, if you look them up online, there's like skeletal hands and spooky shit like that.
Wow. That's cool.
Yeah, it's really cool. So they did that a lot through the 50s. They were banned, quote unquote, in 1958. And then the dawn of the 60s, you sort of saw things like loosening up a little bit. Like there were more like reel-to-reel tape recorders and some lighter restrictions, but really it was not encouraged to buy records or distribute records. Obviously, the 60s, here come the Beatles, the biggest fucking band in the world. And Russia did not have a way to really get their records, shockingly. They were like the records before them, smuggled in, but the risks were super duper high. If you were caught smuggling them in, if you were like I said, like a politician or anybody coming in from another country, you could be banned from traveling abroad. You could be arrested. If you were caught buying the black market records, the KGB would send a letter to your place of work and kind of ruin your life.
Oh my God.
Students could be expelled. And the worst part is they would also take away your record. There's no way to freaking win.
And you couldn't go to school, you had nothing to do, and you can't even stay home all day and listen to your record.
And you're like, I don't even have my record to show for it. So this is all bad. Lose. This is all bad. Yeah, exactly. And then if you had like a relative somewhere else, they couldn't even send you a record in the mail because the KGB would smash it. It was just so unduly hard. I feel bad for these people. But, you know, towards the end of the 60s, as the reel-to-reel and the tape recorders became more widely available, people started, you know, making cassette tapes, which were easier to distribute, obviously. And they were like a little bit cheaper to buy on the black market also. But I thought this was very funny because you've heard the phrase, if you're a cop, you have to tell me you're a cop. Well, not in Soviet Russia. The way that they could tell, like people selling these black market cassette tapes could tell if they were selling to a cop is they would ask them rock trivia, which if you're like me, I get really nervous when people ask me trivia questions. So I feel like I'd fail and they'd think I was a cop. But the question is really, were the Beatles actually banned? They technically weren't. People say all the time, like, you know, rock and roll was banned. Like, there's a lot of documentaries out there talking about, you know, the Beatles being a rebellious force, and they were banned because they preached freedom and these idealistic Western ideas to young people. But they weren't actually technically banned. They were very, very discouraged in the country. The press would mock them. They would troll them on the news if they mentioned them at all. It was still very impossible to find their records, although sometimes their songs could come through a Radio Luxembourg, which I'm sure you all have heard of, which, you know, was basically just a huge radio system coming out of Germany. You could hear it in England. You could hear it into Russia. And finally, the press started to ignore them and just really didn't pay them any mind. They sort of faded. So there were also state-sanctioned Beatles bootlegs under the publisher Melodica, which was Russia's sort of house label, if you will. The song Girl appeared on a folk disc in 1967, but there were no songwriting credits, so you couldn't really tell who it was. And the first full-length LP, the first full-length Beatles LP to be officially released in Russia was A Hard Day's Night, but that wasn't until 1986. So that's pretty wild that it was so long before anybody was able to officially buy a Beatles LP. So as you read about the Beatles in Russia, and also in this Paul Red Square doc that we're going to talk about in a second, there's this big theme where it's like the Beatles meant so much to the Russian people, to Russian fans, much more than they meant to the British fans, the American fans, because of just what they represented, which was the escape from the communist government and the depressing social atmosphere. Obviously, living in communism, it's like there's nothing that's really self-expressive or creative or any of that. It's all state-sanctioned and controlled by the state. So the Beatles were a way to sort of escape that, even if it was for just a few minutes in a song on a bootleg record. Something that has sort of persisted in Beatles lore was that the Beatles played a gig in Moscow in 1968, which obviously didn't happen. There's no fucking way. But there's been a longstanding rumor that that's what inspired Paul to write Back in the USSR.
I love a conspiracy theory.
I do too. I love a conspiracy theory. So just a sidebar, what actually inspired Paul to write Back in the USSR was being in Rishikesh with Mike Love of the Beach Boys. And he sort of wrote it in reaction to California Girls, where if you play them back to back, you can hear the similarities. And Paul would do that a lot, you know, obviously write things that were inspired by other writers. Like he did that with Love and Spoonful, which I love to talk about because I love the Love and Spoonful. He wrote Good Day Sunshine in reaction to Daydream and that kind of thing. So that's where Back in the USSR came from. It actually really had nothing to do with Russia. No matter what Paul says, no matter what anybody else said, it really didn't have anything to do with Russia.
Do you think Paul made up the rumor?
Do you think so? Maybe. We could start that rumor. We could start the rumor that Paul started the rumor.
100% true that Paul started the rumor.
Yeah, he did. He put it out there. He's like, this is going to be great. I mean, we talked at our very first episode about what a marketing genius Paul is. So up through the 80s, there came something called perestroika. And that was a movement to reform the Communist Party, economically, socially, etc. Started in the 80s, championed by Mikhail Gorbachev, who was the Russian president at the time. And he was really like, let's just open Russia up. Let's get some outside influences in here. This is a drag, like, fuck it. And the word perestroika literally means reconstruction. So it was taking everything down to brass tacks, like everywhere in the government. The economy, he wanted to restructure everything about how, like, the Russian financial situation was set up, clear through, like, actually getting entertainment and culture and color, blah, all that, bringing it into the Soviet Union. And it lasted from 1985 to 1991. 91 is when the Soviet Union fell apart and Gorbachev resigned. So that's kind of what ended that. Boris Yeltsin then became president. And perestroika is actually credited as being what brought down the Eastern Bloc and ended the Cold War, finally. Why do we care about this? Well, because Paul released an album in reaction to it. That's why we give a shit.
Generally speaking in life, that's why I give a shit about anything.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's like, okay, this is boring history stuff, but it involves Paul. So let's go there. So you guys, and I truthfully kind of forgot about this album. I'm going to try to say this correctly. Shnovabi sa. Yes, I did Google Translate that. Thank you. I grew up calling it the CHOBA CCCP album because I grew up in Ohio.
CHOBA.
CHOBA, yeah. He released this album in 1988, and it was Paul's first, I believe, covers album. And he sort of made it after Press to Play bombed, and he was like really depressed about that. So as he does, I think when he gets sad, he does a covers album. He Run Double Run after Linda died. I'm just, that's just my opinion. I feel like that's what he does.
What made Kisses on the Bottom? Now I need to unearth the history that found the tragedy that created Kisses on the Bottom.
Kisses on the Bottom is a tragedy because of its title.
Shut the fuck up. Shut the fuck up.
It is the fucking tragedy. I'm sorry.
Take that album's name out of your mouth.
Okay, Will Smith. Can we make a meme? Take Kisses on the Bottom out of your fucking mouth. You are the only person who will ever defend that album to the extent to which you defend that album. I love that that's the hill that you die on.
Fucking love it.
Yeah.
Give me more.
Well, now if it tracks, then yeah, there was some sort of tragedy there. And yeah, I think it's up to you, Erica, to really get to the bottom of that.
I got it.
Good. Press to Play bombed. Sad about that. Makes this covers album. And he had this idea. Here's where his marketing prowess comes in. He's like, let's make this look like it was smuggled out of Soviet Russia. And his marketing, the label and his manager and all those guys were like, this is a bad idea. We hate it. Boo. But as a Christmas gift, his manager had some copies printed up with the cover that we all know and love with the CHOBA CCCP on it and give it to him for Christmas. And then it was like, oh, actually, this is a good idea. Like, maybe we should actually take this copy that you made me and release it in Russia with the Russian on it. And they did. They made up 400,000 copies, which were licensed by Melodica, which is the label that I mentioned earlier. This is the state-sanctioned label. And it was a big import and export for a while. I remember at the very early days of my fandom when you could only get it for very high prices on eBay. Those original 1988 pressings that were in Russia and smuggled out of Russia, ironically, and sold elsewhere on the bootleg market, etc. But then in 1991, as things do, it came out officially worldwide. I think I have a copy of that pressing. Not cool enough to have an original 88 Russian pressing. But, you can also find those songs on like piecemeal singles, etc., that have been sold leading up to that. So that kind of brings us up to Red Square, which was 2003. And it was significant because, Paul has never played Russia. He was very excited to play Russia. But I didn't know this until like this week, but he's not the first Beatle to play Russia. That was fucking Ringo.
Wow.
Ringo played Moscow and St. Petersburg with the All-Star Band in 1998. Now, he didn't play Red Square. Like, that's obviously very significant because it's a government site next to all the government buildings in Moscow. But it's crazy. So, funnily enough, Billy Joel was the first one to play back in the USSR in Russia in 1987,
Jesus.
which I thought was just funny. That was just hilarious.
Good for you, Billy. Good for you.
Billy gets that. He wins that one.
Yeah.
But again, Paul was the first to play Red Square. So throughout this documentary, Paul talks about how Russia feels like it's coming home to him. And he implies he'd been there before. I don't know if he ever went in some like unofficial capacity or what, but like I could not find anything online that said that Paul had ever set foot in Russia prior to 2003.
It was the secret concert in 1968.
Oh shit, maybe he's showing his cards.
Either that or we just proved that he did start the rumor.
Oh shit. Okay, yep. This is tracking. This is great.
It all circles back around. Mm-hmm.
Yes, he slipped up. He slipped up in that documentary. Oh my God.
The evidence is right there.
Yes, because he mentions perestroika, and he sort of calls that out as a moment like in his life that was significant. And I'm like, so as I'm watching this, I'm thinking like, okay, did he go over like, in like 1985 or 86 when perestroika was sort of happening and Russia was opening up and all that? But I literally could not find anything.
It's quite possible that he either went on a scouting trip there for this particular concert, or maybe there was a business trip that involved distribution with the Russian label. I mean, there are some reasons why he might have personally been in Russia before, but it's still a big deal when somebody went to Russia in the 80s.
Yeah, exactly. And that would make sense if he went over at the time of the Covers album, which was released in Russia. But yeah, I couldn't find anything officially about it. So if you guys know anything about a Paul trip prior to 2003 in Russia, let me know, because it's a mystery. But luckily enough, we have this beautiful documentary to commemorate this time. One thing that really struck me is, at first it was like, I'm pretty convinced that Paul only knows one word in Russian. And it's spasibo, which means thanks. But he walks up to everybody and is like, spasibo. So I was like, I spent like an hour Googling. I'm like, this has to be like a slang for hello or something. And then it was like, it dawned on me to just look up common Russian phrases. And it was, sure enough, it means thanks. So spoiler alert, we have a very cool bonus episode coming up, piggybacking on this episode, where I speak to this lovely lady who traveled with Paul while he was in Moscow and taught him Russian for this trip. And she was along for the shows in Moscow and was with him when he met Gorbachev and these really significant moments. And so I asked her, why was he walking up to people saying thanks? Did he just not know what he meant? Her explanation was that maybe it was just sort of saying thanks for welcoming me, thanks for like coming to the concert. And truly, with editing, you never know what they said prior to that, where it could have been like, great show last night, Paul. And he's saying spasibo. To me, it just looks like he's walking up to random people saying spasibo, but like it could be editing. Who knows? But later he does say privyet, which means hello in Russian. I've learned a lot of Russian, guys. Like, I'm super smart about Russian. I know like 3 words now.
Nice. Thanks, Paul.
He also says Rusky a lot, which I'm not sure if that's derogatory or not. So there's one point where he walks up to some guy like on a bridge and he's just like, the guy's like, can I take a picture? And Paul's like, yeah, Rusky. And I'm like, I don't know if that's okay. I don't
know. I'm not even going to comment on that. I have no idea.
Yeah. So something cool. The documentary is so of that era of Paul, which is really special, near and dear to me, because that was the first time I saw him in concert, was 2002. So a lot of this is right around then. Something that's really cool is the incidental music in this documentary is all from Working Classical. And I kind of forgot that album existed.
That's really nice that they used one of his like lesser known classical things as part of the underscoring. At least it gives it some kind of exposure.
Yeah, I agree. And the truck haymakers on that is like one of my favorites. It's so beautiful. So that was really cool to hear all that stuff. The first part of the documentary is in Moscow, which was the first concert, which was in May of 2003. And significantly, that's where Paul also meets Mikhail Gorbachev. And you'll hear Alyona, who is the woman that I referenced earlier, who was with Paul during his time in Moscow. She'll talk about it a little bit more on our bonus episode next week. But Gorbachev just seems like a huge fanboy, which I love. And he was a very personable, warm kind of figure to the Russians. So that sort of makes sense that he would just be totally chill with Paul. Also, when he's in Moscow in the documentary, you see him and Heather on bikes in Red Square, which, when we talk about Heather, we just have to kind of talk about her. She's sort of the elephant in the room in this documentary. Like, I've always wanted to do a Heather episode. I don't know if that's okay or not.
There's no reason why it wouldn't be okay. It all depends on what we say, I guess.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I have a lot of thoughts about Heather. I mean, and like, I have such a love for her Driving Rain and that whole period that it's like I can't hate her 100% because I love that album. But holy shit, seeing her in this documentary was just like a time warp. It was insane. So when you see them on bikes, it's like, oh man, I forgot about the time period of Paul when he was like trying to relive his youth. When he like just married Heather.
When she made him cut and dye his hair, she decided he was too old, so she decided to remake him into something else. Something like that.
Yeah, something like that. So yeah, again, riding bikes in Red Square, they get kind of in trouble with the guards. Next week, you'll hear a lot of stories about this kind of thing, where he was sort of forewarned to not ride his bike around, Red Square, but he did it anyway, and it worked out okay.
He's a rebel. I like it.
He's a rebel. Before we get too much off of Heather, I just need to say this. There's a shot, okay? They're in a private plane, and they're sitting across from each other, and Paul is, like, rubbing her foot, and I did not like it. I didn't like it. Like, why would they show that?
There was a lot of affection in the documentary. A lot of Paul and Heather.
Like, a lot. PDA. Like, they were kissing a lot in this documentary.
This was fairly early, right? Because they were married in, 2001?
I think she was 2000. Pregnant.
Was she already pregnant at this point?
Yeah, because they had their child in October, I think, of 2003. So she would have been pregnant.
So maybe he was just like basking in the glow of impending fatherhood with her.
But holy crap, like so much kissing and so much affection, so much PDA between Paul and Heather. Ugh,
well, it's one of the only times you're going to see it because, again, in a comparison to the 9/11 documentary, which was edited 10 years after the fact, Heather disappeared because they had 10 years of hindsight to get rid of her.
I totally love that you just compared like seeing Heather in this to a 9/11 documentary. I just, in some way, like just those things just juxtaposed together. That was amazing. You know what? Rewatching this documentary really wants me to go back and rewatch Back in the US. Like I think that came out in 2003 about the Driving Rain tour. Because in my memory, she's in there a lot, and there's a lot of drams that I can remember between her and Paul. That documentary.
Yes.
I need to rewatch. So exciting. But speaking of Driving Rain, I got really excited because you can see on Abe's drum head is still the Driving Rain tour stuff, and also in the concerts. Like, it was such a visceral memory for me because it was the same, like, graphics and stuff that he used on that tour. Did you see him on that tour? Like, the 2002, 2003?
I didn't, but I saw him on the one after the Chaos Tour, so 2005, 2006, and a lot of what he had done then was still kind of carrying over his style, like the jeans and the landmine stuff and the haircut. A lot of the graphics were all kind of in there. That all meshes those, like, 5 or so years of Paul's life.
Totally. Yeah. I just remembered, watching the Red Square doc, how when he would perform, I saw her standing there and he would do the black and white, kind of like staticky TV imagery all around him. Like, I remember loving that on that tour. I thought that was so cool.
Yeah.
And it was a nice recall to have that. Because I was like, oh, that's such a nice memory. Oh, so
that was like the 40-year anniversary of the Beatles and Sullivan, if we're talking about 2003, 2004.
That's true. Wow.
And I think he kept those graphics for the 2005 tour. I remember those.
That sounds about right. So yeah, anyway, proceeding onward, the second part, sort of the middle part, I guess, of this documentary is in St. Petersburg. And it really just centers around Paul giving a masterclass at the Glinka School, which is just like a music school. He sort of takes this like young group of like 4 guys like under his wing. So one's like a classical guitar player with a piano player. He doesn't really give them much constructive criticism or advice that I saw. He just sort of hangs out and he's like, yeah, that's good.
Wasn't the second part filmed at a totally different trip?
Yes.
Like, wasn't it like done a year later or something?
St. Petersburg was a year later. So they went back in, I believe, June of 2004.
Okay, so after Heather had the baby and...
Yes, but they're still fucking kissing in St. Petersburg. It's like, goddamn. Because, so Paul goes to the St. Petersburg Conservatory and he gets this honorary doctorate. And he's like super excited because he's quote unquote walking the steps that Tchaikovsky walked. He gives a speech in Russian from like these little note cards. And then, like, again, in that sort of classical Paul era that we're still kind of coming out of at this point, you see a bunch of orphans singing Human Theme from Standing Stone. I forgot Standing Stone even existed until I saw that. I'm like, oh yeah, there was that.
More very deep cuts being represented in this thing.
No, very much so. But then, so the doc circles back to the Kremlin, which is in Moscow. So I guess the St. Petersburg part was just a little interlude, just a little treat, you know, a snack in the middle of this documentary. Because then it's like Putin time, USA, or USSR, should I say. I don't even know how to start this. Like, it's so outrageous to me. So we see Paul and Heather meeting with Putin, and the first thing that happens is crazy. So they sit down to talk in this like room with like this nice like spread of like snacks out in front of them, which would look great. And Paul sits down in the chair sort of next to Putin. And what he does is he makes like an excuse to Heather where it's like, oh, he asked me to sit over here. Basically, is that okay? Sorry, you're sitting so far away from Putin. And I'm like, oh, you don't need to fucking say that to Heather. You're Paul McCartney. You're the one that was invited here. And this is the president of Russia. So yeah, no, she can sit on the couch. It's like across from you guys. But I thought that like spoke volumes, you know, about their dynamic between them.
Mm-hmm. Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
It's very uncomfortable.
It was super uncomfortable. I mean, the whole thing was tense because it's Putin and he looks like a violent mole, but it's the whole thing just with her there was just crazy uncomfortable.
Wearing the most violent red color suit.
Right? I mean, Paul's got that like pinky shirt on and you can see inside his jacket, it's like a red sort of lining, but she's just like, I'm in Russia. I'm going to wear red. I'm going to scream it, you know?
It was a lot. It was a lot. Like when she was sitting there, I just kept imagining her like sharpening her fangs or something. You know,
right?
It's just so over the top.
Yeah, that was definitely a big statement to make. So we see them have like a conversation. Paul does his voiceover. He's like, deep down, Putin's just an ordinary guy like we all are. And then he's like, oh, he seems very genuine and he's got working class values. And then, quote unquote, no wonder the people like him.
No, Paul.
No. Somebody get the squirt bottle. No.
No.
And then Paul's like, oh, did you listen to the Beatles growing up? Putin says, yeah. I was like very, invested in this answer. And he says, yes. And then, quote unquote, it was like a gulp of freedom. Your music was like an open window to the world. It's like, who the fuck is this guy?
Shut the fuck up, Putin, about freedom.
Yeah. Like, I cannot
open windows to the world. Fuck you.
Fuck you. Like, really? Come on. Like, it was, I'm still speechless when I think about it because it's like, what the fuck? Are you for real? Are you for real right now?
It's just so crazy with the lens of 20 years hindsight to think about how this was probably like a goodwill trip. Like, look at how Russia is progressing and changing, and we can have this thing. And look at the people being able to enjoy this concert in Red Square. And look at, he's just a normal guy, and he's such a popular president.
Yes.
What?
So I remember very distinctly watching this documentary. I think it aired on A&E here in the States, and I didn't know shit about politics because that was back when you didn't have to care about politics if you were like young and dumb. And how old was I when this came out? Maybe like 15, 16. And I didn't know who fucking Vladimir Putin was. So I was like, oh, he seems cool. Like, he seems chill. Paul likes him. And
He
the
likes
people
Paul
seem to like
McCartney.
him. Yeah, exactly. It's like he, and also, that was the time when we had George Bush here. So anything looked good compared to that.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So I was like, oh,
Yeah.
Putin, he seems like a real like Democrat. Like, he's cool. Like, the people, when he, spoiler alert, shows up to Paul's show later in this documentary, like, they go apeshit for him. So I remember thinking very positively of Putin for years because of this. And to be fair, he wasn't quite so monstrous publicly until the last, like 5 or 10 years, I think.
This is a real argument for the importance of term limits.
Dude, totally. We often forget how long Putin has been in office. Since the Heather Mills days, guys. It's been a long time. So Paul mentions Putin. He's like, well, Beatles music was banned. And Putin says it was considered, quote unquote, propaganda, alien ideology, which you'll see quoted all the time. Like, the alien ideology is quoted a lot, not only about the Beatles, but about rock and roll in Russia. And then my favorite part of the whole thing, Paul mentions fucking landmines, because of course he does.
Oh my God.
Because he was going to get yelled at if he didn't fucking mention landmines. Mm-hmm. And then Heather gets her like 2 cents in with Putin. And Putin's like, yeah, I know your wife is really actively involved in campaigning against landmines. And that also got me thinking, it's like, what the hell happened to No More Landmines? If you're curious, it shut down in 2015. I had no idea.
Was it a thing that was run by Paul and Heather, or by Heather, and then it kind of shut down as Heather abandoned interest, or was it an external organization?
So this is totally random, but I met somebody when I was in college who also had his leg. Well, also, Heather did not have her leg blown off by a landmine. This guy actually did. So I met him, and he had done some work with No More Landmines, and he met Paul and Heather. And he actually had nothing but good things to say about both of them. So I asked him about the charity, and he's like, oh, yeah, it's been around for a while, but it's obviously gotten a big boost because now they're so super involved. So I can only imagine that it had already been in existence, but the notoriety and the press and all that, and probably the donations and that kind of thing it got from being associated with like Paul and Heather probably was astronomical. So when that all went away, it probably was a struggle to maybe keep it going. And I don't know that even Heather does much with landmines these days. I know she's very involved in like her V-Bites, or whatever the fuck she's doing.
She still does a lot of work and like counseling for amputees and work with like amputees in sports and things like that. So I'm not sure if she's pivoted away totally from the landmines issue, but she's still doing like amputee work.
That makes sense, yeah. And who knows, maybe her not doing much with landmines anymore is because, No More Landmines shut down. It doesn't have to be related, but yeah, I was just so curious. And quite honestly, when I was going to these Paul shows, I was like, man, it's been 20 years since I saw Paul the first time. That was like his No More Landmines tour. I really want one of those stupid shirts. And I could not find one. They're on eBay now for a lot of money. I wish I'd have bought one back in like 2002.
See, I mean, that's what you got to do. When you see that shirt you want, you see that thing you want, you got to get it. Because you never know. And 20 years later, you wish you had.
You wish you had a No More Landmines t-shirt.
Yep.
Damn it.
Mm-hmm. I'm not going to lie. I was telling you the other day, I wish I had I saw Paul McCartney in Brooklyn shirt from one night in 2018.
No, but that shirt is amazing. That shirt is iconic. And that was truly one night only for that shirt.
No More Landmines is iconic in its own way, though, for this community.
Is. He wore a fucking Von Dutch design No More Landmines, which if there's nothing else that says 2003 more than that.
Nope. It's amazing.
For sure. So anyway, so Heather's like, do you think Russia will ever join the landmine ban? Which I remember that being a big topic around then. And Putin says, anything that saves people's lives deserves our utmost attention. LOL. God damn.
Oh, he's a riot, that Putin. He's funny.
He sucks. I hate this guy. Oh my god.
I kept thinking though, when he had said to her, I know, or to Paul or somebody, I know all about Heather's involvement with the landmines issue, I just imagine this whole thing like Paul telling his people, like, you need to make sure that he knows this is Heather's thing because she's going to ream me if I don't make this happen.
Yes.
And then so he got like all these people so nervous that like imparted this sense of urgency to like Putin's fucking advisors to say, make sure you know the wife, Heather, her name, what she does.
This is very important. It's his press person for this tour, well, the whole tour, but like these shows and this meeting as well, I'm sure it was Jeff Baker, who was his press agent for a very, very, very long time. And I can only imagine Jeff Baker being like, guys, like, this is for reals, okay? Like, Paul needs you to know this, and he's got to ask about the fucking landmines.
Because you don't film a conversation with Putin without Putin knowing what's going to be said in advance.
Exactly. It's like, I know about your wife's involvement in the landmines. Oh my God. Like, that's so funny. So good. It's God. Like, he's just, I hope he secretly winked at Paul where it's like, I got your message, bud. I got you.
I got you.
You're not going to get bitch slapped tonight. Don't worry. Good Lord.
And this is why we're on the fence about doing an episode about Heather.
Yeah, it could go downhill. I feel like I'm being very restrained right now, which, I mean, I'm not sure if I sound that way, but it could be very bad.
Yeah.
And like later, just to wrap up the Heather talk, but later when Putin says goodbye to Paul and Heather, Heather goes, say hello to your wife and kids. Like, shut up. Like, we get it. You're the wife and you're doing the fucking diplomatic thing. Like, just go. Get out of here. Like, you both can go away. Just go away and leave Paul alone. Jesus Christ.
I mean, I feel like they'd have a lot in common, but that's the last I'm going to say about Heather.
Yes, okay. Yes, that's good. That's a good conclusion to the Heather segment. Anyway, so Paul asked Putin if he was going to come to the concert in Red Square. Putin's like, nah. So Paul privately played him Let It Be. The spoiler alert, which we've already revealed, is that Putin shows up at the concert. But before we leave the Kremlin, I just want to make note that Paul fucking asked somebody about Rasputin. I had to pause and I was crying, laughing when he's like, oh, Rasputin. I'm like, shut up. Are you serious, Paul?
I know one thing about Russia, and that's that there's a guy with like a foot-long dick, and I want to know if it's really in a jar in a museum in St. Petersburg, and it's the only thing I care about.
Oh my God. I actually forgot that. I forgot about that, about Rasputin, until you just said it.
Paul
oh my God.
Didn't forget.
Paul remembered. Paul, take me to the dick. It's in a jar and I know it. Oh my God.
It's just like Eleanor Rigby's face. I'm going to write a new song.
Oh my God. Can he? Can he still? Oh God, that's so funny. I feel like through this documentary, Paul, whenever he opens his mouth, I'm just like, shh. Because he just sounds not so smart this whole documentary. And I don't know. I would imagine he was very nervous going into it. I imagine he was like, I know from talking to Alyona, who was accompanying him, like he really did want to like make an effort to show he tried to learn Russian. He wanted to be like he wanted to, communicate with the Russian people. But like, I just feel like he says some of the dumbest crap in this documentary. And I love him for it. I really do. But like, walking around the Kremlin and just randomly asking somebody about Rasputin is the cream of the crop as far as this documentary goes.
But I feel like that's when Paul's true essence came out. Like,
I love it.
Really like, yeah, I'm all for diplomacy and this is a great goodwill visit, but I really want to know.
I know. He's like, okay, I did a good job, right? Now I get to ask my question. It's like, I would want to know this. I'm like, I want to know this stupid trivia crap too about Russia. It's like, can you take me to where like, on nostalgia was shot in the head? Like, I just want to know the morbid, macabre, like crazy crap. That was probably my favorite moment in the whole doc.
Well, that says a lot.
Yes, exactly. Exactly, it does. So anyway, the actual concert in Moscow, which we'll talk to Alyona a little bit about next week, she was there and she got to witness like Putin coming in the middle of the show, which I actually loved because he comes in during Calico Skies. And who would have known if Calico Skies would have actually made it the doc if Putin hadn't come in during the song? It actually happened that way. It wasn't like interspersed in the doc. So you see the crowd sort of parting and Putin and his entourage come through. And allegedly, Jeff Baker has said that he was accompanied by a general who was handcuffed to a briefcase that contained nuclear codes.
Sounds pretty Russian.
That's so fucking Russian, right? Like, come on, you can't write this shit. Like, is that real? Baker also said that Putin had sort of timed his arrival. Like, they did not know he was coming. That's totally true. Like, he had said he wasn't going to come, and they were under that thought the whole night. But he thought that Putin arrived intentionally after Paul had played back in the USSR, because obviously the USSR was the Soviet Union. Soviet Union came down in the early 90s, so he didn't want to be seen as like celebrating the Soviet Union. But fucking Paul sees Putin come in during Calico Skies, and then what does he do? He plays back in the USSR again. Good job,
I love
Paul.
it.
Love it. I mean, he probably was like, oh, it's so much fun. I'm celebrating Russia, and Putin's here now. And then Putin's like heavily trolled by Paul.
That was the day that Putin turned from a nice president to the man we have today.
That's what happened. Oh, Paul, you did that.
That was the moment.
You shouldn't have played that song, Paul.
Should have played Calico Skies the second time.
Yes, if you're going to play a song twice, Calico Skies is a good choice, for sure.
Agreed.
Something else about the show, which I remember hearing about when he played it, but I totally forgot, was that they controlled the weather with like chemicals. I totally forgot about this, but they sent up like little rockets or something that had this chemical.
That's real? I thought that was just like Russian sci-fi bullshit.
Yeah, that's fucking real because
holy shit.
Because it was confirmed by Jeff Baker, who apparently gave the call, because it looked like rain all day, and they were like, I hope it doesn't rain, whatever. And the Russians were like, hey, we have this thing that we could do if you want to. And Jesus. Jeff Baker's like, really? And they're like, yeah. And they're like, just let us know. And he's like, okay, just do it. And he said he's not sure whether or not they actually did it, but he's like pretty sure that actually happened.
God.
And he also said there were snipers on top of buildings. So there's that as well.
Okay. Well, you know what? If it's to protect Paul, I'm okay with protecting Paul.
Yes, exactly. I'm not sure the rain, if the rain or the chemicals were worse, but you know. But yeah, so the people in the show, like, they fucking love Putin. He walks in, he's like a rock star. And all the Russians pretty much interviewed in the documentary say they're quote unquote proud of Putin for saying the Beatles' music was a breath of fresh air. And it's just, it's wild, you know, knowing what we know now, obviously how revered Putin was. But again, like, was that propaganda? Because it totally influenced how I felt about Putin for the longest.
Anything that you could classify as like a goodwill trip is propaganda in its own right. And, you know, when you're talking about Putin, it's definitely propaganda, because everything that they do is engineered to give a certain impression. And I'm sure this was a wonderful boon for Putin. I mean, not only having this thing out there, but him coming to the concert in the middle of the show when he said he wasn't, that makes him look like such a good guy. It totally says so much about his direction for the country, in that, you know, the Beatles were banned. The Beatles were something that everybody wanted in the 60s and in the 80s, and people got in a lot of trouble for trying to acquire this. And, you know, look at him just like walking into this Paul McCartney concert, loving it, wanting it, welcoming it. That could have gotten him an actually, you know, fairly elected term, another term.
Exactly. Yeah, 100%. And also for all of us who are sort of watching this from the outside too, you're going, if the president of Russia is a cool guy, Russia's cool now, you know, and he's a Paul fan, just like the rest of us, you know, it's like Russia's kind of joining the rest of the world culturally. I mean, all the way around, this was probably one of the best PR moves of Putin's career, I think.
Yeah, and I think showing Gorbachev was another really smart move in that way, because they connected the, you know, communism with the perestroika movement with today's Russia, or at least in 2003 or whenever. And they showed Gorbachev as this like sweet, kind old man who's getting along with Paul McCartney. There's a lot there.
There's a lot to unpack. I mean, there's obviously like layers and layers and layers below this documentary that are just, there's so much. We're just scratching the surface. And of course, throughout the documentary, there's a lot of talk about like unity and how oh, bless you. That was Epi, just sneezed into the microphone.
Hey,
Epi. He just was like, oh, you're bashing Heather? Did I miss that? Yeah, sorry, Eps. You missed that. But yeah, of course, throughout the documentary, there's a lot of talk about unity and we're all one and the Beatles connect us all. And, talk about propaganda. I don't know, this could be a hot take, but there's always been a lot of books written and articles written and a lot of things said about how like the Beatles took down communism, which I don't know is a little bit of a stretch for me. I think there was a lot at play there. So it's sort of like giving Paul a lot of credit for a lot of things. And I don't deny him the fact that like his music, the Beatles music, gave people hope in a time when it was hopeless. I think that's totally true. We've all been there with music. Music has that property. But it's like the glorifying of it is a little much sometimes.
It's certainly going over the top to make a point in this specific documentary. Right. I think that if you're really looking at the big picture, the Beatles were a symbol of a certain type of freedom that people really wanted. And I think people were going to great lengths to get the music because it was, a proxy for the freedom in some ways. Yeah. But it wasn't just the Beatles. I mean, in the 80s, like American blue jeans were a big fucking deal in Russia too. It was another thing that was being considered contraband and being smuggled into the country. So there were a number of things that cultural touch points in Western society that, really symbolize the idea of freedom to Russia. But certainly the Beatles were one of them. And Paul used to, I don't think it's his story right now, but when he does Love Me Do, sometimes he talks about how when he went to Russia that people would say, that he met there, dignitaries would say, I learned English from listening to Love Me Do, from listening to your records.
Yes. Well, I think you hear the defense minister, he tells a story of like, Love Me Do. And when he says, Love Me Do, it just reminded me of when Paul tells that story because he loves bless you. He tells that story where he's like, Love Me Do. And I'm like, ugh. Yeah, shockingly, he doesn't tell that story or play Back in the USSR on the tour at the moment.
That's true.
Yeah. Bless you. Epi is just seasoned.
Look, he just wants to make himself known. I'm happy. Rosie had her turn earlier. Now Epi is taking the mic.
You are. Yes, exactly.
I thought he told that story before Love Me Do. He told it before Back in the USSR.
No. He tells it before Love Me Do. Oh, wait, does he?
I don't remember if he swaps off between that and like singing the Love Me Do part. Those are his two Love Me Do's. I don't know. Yeah. I can't remember. It very well could have been before Back in the USSR. I just couldn't remember where he told it.
I think definitely closer to the time when he actually went to Moscow. He loved to tell that story because I think that was more in people's minds. So he was sort of like, a couple of years ago we went to Moscow, and everybody goes, woo, like that whole thing, and then tells the Let Me Do story. But I don't remember. It may have been before Back in the USSR, but yeah, he definitely would love to talk about his Russian trip a lot. I remember shows post this. I mean, it was obviously super duper special to him, and I could not find fault with that. It's an amazing trip. It's an amazing accomplishment for somebody who certainly grew up knowing about Russia as a communist entity with the Cold War, post World War II, with all that means, and to have that sort of honor to like play this big show in Red Square. There's a really touching moment at the very end of the documentary where Paul talks about his dad and how if he had told his dad, when he was a teenager, Dad, guess what? I'm going to be playing for the Russian president in Red Square and I'm going to go to the Kremlin and all this stuff. Like his dad would have thought he was crazy, but he did it. And it was just so sweet that all these years later, it's like he's still thinking like, I made my dad proud. He would be proud of me.
Yeah. I always love it when he talks about Jim. Part of the reason I love the album Kisses on the Bottom so much.
Oh, yeah, that's true. There is the Jim tie-in, but even Jim McCartney can't say it.
Ah, boo. No, but I was thinking too, like people who are older than we are, who actually lived through the Cold War, this is even a much bigger deal. Like I don't remember the Cold War, but there are people in other generations who had to do like desk drills at school. There was McCarthyism, and there was a lot of crazy stuff that happened because of this. There was the space race. I mean, there was a lot of Russian stuff that I don't register. Like, I don't think about that when I think about Russia because I didn't experience it. But somebody who's Paul's age experienced that.
Yeah.
Being there, being an ambassador for Western culture and being accepted is probably a huge deal.
Absolutely. And the fact that the Beatles could not tour there. Like, that was just a non-starter. And knowing the Red Scare, and you talk about McCarthyism, but like, the very real or imagined, depending on what you believe, but like the governments being afraid of the spread of communism and them going to places we'll talk about later, in a few weeks about when they went to the Philippines, the Beatles, and how that was in the very, very beginning stages of what would be martial law. Yeah, absolutely. It's a super loaded, and it had to be terrifying and exciting and surreal for him, Paul McCartney, who still thinks about making his dad proud, to sit down in the Kremlin with the Russian president. Like, that, I don't know. That makes me a little proud for him that he did that, even though it was Putin.
Yeah. All of the progress that happened with Russia, it still happened, even though Putin is a monster and is doing some horrific things right now.
Yes.
There was that sense of progress in the releasing of the Cold War. So it's not all for naught.
Exactly. So, I guess at the end of the day, it's really important to understand the context of this documentary, especially because of what we're living through right now with Russia and Ukraine. But yeah, at the moment, it's a great little snapshot of Paul's life at that point.
Yeah.
And, where the world was, and the post 9/11 world where unity was really the factor of it all, kind of what everybody was working to achieve. So I was curious. I was like, what is Paul really, I know, as we saw, he trots out these stories about Russia and Love Me Do and that kind of thing. But I wasn't sure, what his deal was with Russia these days. Until last week, I did learn firsthand how he feels about it.
The earliest thing I found about Paul and Russia post this concert was that he was one of the artists speaking out against the imprisonment of the Russian punk rock band Pussy Riot. I don't know if you remember this.
Yeah, I forgot about this.
Yeah. A female punk rock and performance art band, and they were arrested for an unauthorized performance on the altar of Moscow's Christ the Savior Cathedral, where they asked for divine intervention to rid Russia of Vladimir Putin, who was then running for his third presidential term.
Love it.
And Paul was one of the first folks to speak out. Madonna did, Sting did, a number of other artists just demanding that this is a freedom of speech issue and that Pussy Riot be released from jail.
Nice. I love that about Paul. I like that he doesn't double down on shit. Like, I feel like now, we talked a little bit earlier about how he was talking to Bill Clinton about Harvey Weinstein. I feel like Paul would be the first one to be like, yep, that was problematic. Like, fuck both of them. Obviously with this, you see Paul be like, yeah, no, he was a monster, actually. And the next year, he pens this open letter to Putin, which starts Dear Vladimir, which made me laugh, about releasing 28 Greenpeace activists and 2 journalists that were arrested at a protest at an oil drilling site. I remember he posted on Facebook and he was like, yep, still haven't heard back. But, he was very vigilant about calling out Putin for his egregious activities. And then, I love this. I didn't know this going into the shows. At the end of the show, like, he and the band come out carrying flags. They carry usually the American flag, the British flag, the state flag where they're playing, and the last few years, they've been carrying the rainbow flag. And this time, Paul himself is carrying the Ukrainian flag, which was amazing. I was very excited about that. I love that so much. It was so great, and so great to see his support.
I can imagine over the years, as he saw Donald Trump's relationship with Putin, that any sense of goodwill that may have been engendered during this trip might have fallen away.
Yes, that whole thing is a whole other can of worms. But yeah, I think it was really powerful and really cool, as we're taking a look back at Paul's time in Russia, to realize that it's sort of come full circle in a different way, where he's like, nah, you know what, I'm going to publicly side with Ukraine on this. And, he's Paul, he's a musician, but he's also like one of the most important pop culture figures, I think, in history. So it's a really powerful statement. And I hope fucking Putin takes notice, because fuck you, Putin.
I hope so too. All right, we end this episode as we always end with our latest Beatles obsession of the moment. Allison, what's yours?
I'm going to make this real short and sweet for you all. My weird Beatles obsession, I say weird because it's strange to me, is having done this episode, seeing Paul in concert and reflecting on my 20 years of seeing Paul live. I just had this like weird thirst for Paul from 2002 to 2007, like right up to memory almost full. And don't get me wrong, I love that era of Paul too. But there's just something about that like 4 or 5 years in there that is just really, it's really got me right now. Like,
Aw.
I know. This past week, I went back. This is so embarrassing. I went back and reread this terrible, terrible fanfic that I wrote during that time. And if anybody knows me and read that back when I was posting it on LiveJournal, yes, you heard that correctly. No, you didn't. And you never read it. But I went back and read it. It's awful. It's terrible. But it was written about Paul during this period. So it was like old Paul fic.
How smutty was it?
Not very.
Did it involve Rasputin?
No Rasputin, although,
Okay.
it might be worth it while to go back and edit some Rasputin in there just for to historical accuracy.
Exactly, yes.
But yeah, I went back and reread that because I was just sort of like, oh, I'm curious. And it's a very strange fanfic. But yeah, I don't know. I've just been very in the pocket with that this week. I've been, really going back and re-listening to like Driving Rain and some of the live album, the Back in the US album. I think it's a weird nostalgia trip for me, but I'm not going to fight it because Paul at that time he could still get it. He could really still get it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Oh, sure. Some really good music came out at that time too.
I agree. Although we know that, I'll always apologize for Driving Rain.
Yeah, I know. I mean, I'm not counting the song Heather in that statement that I made, but I know you do.
I listened to Heather like yesterday, unironically, and I was like, okay, yes, it's a piano scale that she was stupid enough to think was an actual song, and yes, it's actually how it was written, but I don't know, it's okay. It's a cute little tune,
If he didn't creepily whisper Heather like he was waiting in the bushes to murder her, maybe it would be all right. It's horrible.
Yeah, if he could have left that out, that would have been preferable. That's true.
But then it just would have been warm-up scales.
Right, and then it would have been like a cute little coda, because he does that a lot with his albums, right? He tacks on the coda at the end. It would have just been the same thing. The secret track at the end of Off the Ground, a little cosmically conscious, but...
Totally.
Yeah, sadly, he did the creepy thing and ruined it. But anyway, I still love that. And, watching this documentary, I was also reminded about his little watch that he had, that he took the cover photo for Driving Rain on. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if I've ever told the story on the podcast, but I asked for that for Christmas that year and I got it. I got that watch.
You still have it?
I do. It's somewhere. And it was obviously the only thing I got because it was $200 or something, which was a lot back then, guys. But it was so cool. I loved that thing. I took photos with it. I was obsessed with that watch. So seeing him with that watch on just took me back to that too. And those couple of years where I wore that thing nonstop.
If you ever unearth the watch or pictures that you took with the watch, we got to see them.
I'm sure they're somewhere. I'm sure they are. I remember I take pictures with my friends at school and I loved it. But yeah, so I'm working through my thirst. That's my quite literal obsession because there have been moments where I'm I cannot stop thinking about Paul in 2003.
Oh my God, I fucking love it.
It's amazing. Crazy. What about you, dude?
Amazingly, I decided to break the mold and not talk about something involving Paul, which is surprising even to me.
That's crazy.
As a lot of people know, at least in the United States right now, legalizing marijuana is a big deal. Especially where I am in New York and New Jersey, you're starting to pass lots of laws and there's going to be some interesting partnerships happening. And one that I found out about today was that the estate of George Harrison is partnering with a cannabis maker called Dad Grass on a line of Dad Grass. And they are creating a line of weed products under the brand name All Things Must Grass.
No.
Yeah. So the company itself, they make things like pre-rolled joints, CBD products, and other marijuana-related paraphernalia. They are very excited about the fact that not only are they going to be able to feature the photo shoot from the album and play on that, but they can also use the gnomes. They're very excited to be able to use the images of the gnomes, the garden gnomes from Friar Park that are on the cover of All Things Must Pass as part of the design for All Things Must Grass. So this is just delightful. I cannot wait to see when this stuff actually comes out. And I feel like this is what George would have always wanted. So good on the estate.
hilarious. Also, grass, it's also about gardening. So I'm sure George is very happy wherever he is.
George and his gnomes.
Yes, those gnomes, man, they hit it big. They're like celebrities for all time.
And now people will look at those gnomes when they're smoking All Things Must Grass and ponder the big questions of the world.
Yes, well, that is something to look forward to, I suppose, if you're into that sort of thing. And wow, I am speechless. I mean, I do a lot of work with the Grateful Dead in my day-to-day life, and they have a weed partnership, I believe, which makes total sense. And it's nice to know that George is also getting one.
Just as he would have wished.
Yes, exactly. Wow. Well, on that note, go get your pre-order in. I'm sure all things must grass. And thanks for listening to Because the Beatles. As always, follow the show on iTunes, Apple Podcasts, wherever you are listening right now. And please, please give us a rating and review so other Beatlemaniacs can find us.
And follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. We'll be posting photos and more from this episode and beyond. And remember, you can always email us at bcthebeatles@gmail.com. All right, see you next time.
Bye.